So today is Monday, August 17th, 2015, and this is the Silver Lake Neighborhood Council History Collective, and we're interviewing Marshall Wong today, and it's Michael Masterson and Marco Larson on the camera, and Mark, Simon, and Cheryl Rifkin doing the interview. All right. So welcome, thank you so much. Marshall, why don't you tell us when you were born and where you were born, and were you born actually here in Silver Lake?
I was born at Kaiser Sunset in 1959.
Wow.
And my parents had been living in Southern California for about 8 years and had been living in Silver Lake for about 3
years, so maybe 1955, 1956, they moved to Silver
Oh, actually, no, this is why I had to bring
okay.
my crib notes. It was at 1953 that they were able to purchase an open piece of land in Silver Lake.
Oh, so they built their home?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, I see, from scratch. And tell me a little bit about where your parents and your grandparents came from.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's see. Some of our family arrived in the U.S. as far back as the Gold Rush. So depending on how you count, some people would consider me a fifth generation Chinese American. Some people would say sixth generation. Both of my grandmothers were born in California, which was unusual because back at that time of history, there was a huge imbalance between the male Chinese laborers who were allowed into the U.S. and very, very tight restrictions on how many females were allowed in. So there was a huge gender imbalance dating back from, the Gold Rush days and later the Chinese Exclusion Act. Both of my grandfathers were born in southern China. The province is Guangdong. And that is the area that the great majority of early Chinese immigrants to the U.S. came from. And they sort of spoke a lingua franca, that represented, the rural counties where they were from.
Did they go to San Francisco, or they came to Bakersfield, did you say? Or
well,
your grandfather's?
On my maternal side, my grandfather went to San Francisco and met my grandmother there and married and raised his family. Actually outside, they moved to a town called Vallejo, where my mother was born and raised. Very, very tiny town that I think largely ran because it was a port. And then
and that was around the 1920s or something?
Earlier.
Earlier.
My mother was born in 21. And so this would have probably been maybe about 5 years earlier than that when my grandfather arrived.
And was Vallejo primarily populated by Chinese people?
Oh, no. I think that I get the actual sequence of events a little confused because I've seen period photos of my mother in kindergarten where it was a primarily Chinese class, and I think that was in Oakland. But in Vallejo, they were one of a handful of Chinese families in the entire town. As a matter of fact, when they were growing up, my grandfather and a couple of the other Chinese families, they're arranged for a Chinese teacher to come from San Francisco once a week to provide Saturday instruction for their children. They were pretty isolated and outnumbered. My other grandfather moved to the Central Valley and wound up somehow in Kern County and met my grandmother there and raised a family in Bakersfield. Back then, the immigration laws were very, very different than today. As opposed to my grandfathers becoming citizens because they married US-born women. It was the opposite. Both of my grandmothers lost their citizenship, and they were stateless for a number of years. They weren't allowed to vote or own property, and they had to apply as though they were coming to the US for the first time years later to be able to regain their citizenship. They belong to no country since they have never been outside of the US.
There wasn't an objection on the part of their parents to them marrying native Chinese husbands then, because they would lose, their rights as citizens?
I asked my mother about this, and she thought that they probably were unaware that that's what was going to happen. That none of my grandparents had much formal education. Both of my grandmothers had to leave school after a few years to help raise younger siblings. And in traditional Chinese families, especially at that time, education was not encouraged for the female children. They weren't expected really to have careers
and vote.
Things like that. So I don't think that they were probably aware until after it happened and they lost their citizenship. Back then there were also anti-miscegenation laws in place, and so it wasn't as though they could, they had to marry, this is the early 1900s. If they wanted to marry, it had to be to someone else Chinese. It wasn't permitted otherwise.
So then how did everyone get to Los Angeles?
My parents were both, they were pioneers in a lot of different ways. They were both the first members of their families to attend college. And actually both of them wound up going through grad school as well. They met as undergraduates at Berkeley.
At Berkeley?
And, yes. Where they were both from small towns, and so this was like a big culture shock for them to go to a huge campus where my mother said that she had classes where there were more students than in her entire high school. Wow. And it was a wonderful experience for them to have exposure to ideas and possibilities that had not been open to their parents' generation or to many of their own contemporaries. So my father graduated right after Pearl Harbor was bombed, and so he and most of his friends enlisted right after graduation. And he flew, he was a navigator. And not all branches of the armed services were open to minorities, and so that was not his first choice, but he wound up joining the, I guess back then it would be the Air Corps.
Air Corps.
And so he flew missions over Germany and occupied France.
Wow.
Based in yes, and so I think that my mother, after graduating, worked a while, and then someone really suggested that she consider graduate school, which was, her parents were not supportive of that. Education for girls, and she was the first Asian woman to enroll in the graduate school of social welfare at Smith. So that was like a big, big deal for the small town girl to leave everything that was familiar and the kind of expectations of a very traditional family and strike out on her own.
So they weren't married at this point?
No. So they had dated before, and then they continued to correspond. She completed her master's and was offered a job in New Orleans, of all places. She lived in the French Quarter. This is during World War II, where it was completely legal segregation. She didn't know where she fit in when she had to choose where to sit on the bus, which drinking fountain or bathroom to use. She would get stares no matter what. And but she was having the time of her life, making her own money, having an interesting career as a psychiatric social worker. My father completed all his missions, was discharged from the military. Well, actually what happened is when he completed his missions, he came stateside, and the armed forces sent him to take some business classes at Harvard. He was still, part of the working in a more civilian capacity, for the military. And it was at that time that someone who took an interest in him, a mentor, asked him if he'd ever considered law school. And so with the encouragement of one of his supervisors, he started warming up to the idea. As soon as World War II ended, he was among the first to be discharged. And he immediately made application to go to Stanford Law School, which had shrunk during World War II down to a handful of students because of the war. So his was the first class after that, and he was the only person of color. I believe there are no women in his class. I'd have to go back and double check on that. But if there were very few.
Yeah.
And it was during his time in law school that he continued to correspond and decided to pay a visit to New Orleans. He took the train, and on the way he made a stop, purchased an engagement ring, and wrote up his first legal contract, which meant that within a certain period of time he could return the ring, no questions asked. So he visited her in New Orleans, proposed, and fortunately never had to return the ring.
And his intention was to practice law, some kind of law?
Yes.
Do you know what his initial
Well, there weren't a whole lot of
intentions?
opportunities. When he graduated from Stanford and took the bar, he couldn't get a job in a firm. So the choices were doing something like going into your own business, and typically what people would, the handful of Chinese lawyers that existed back then, and there were very few, would do things like practice immigration law in Chinatown.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
And so he looked for opportunities in government employment.
Oh.
So his first job out of law school was with the Office of the Legislative Council. So he was one of the people assigned to do research for the state legislature.
I see.
And after they married, they moved to Sacramento, where their first child, my sister, was born. And it was actually a transfer opportunity to the Office of the Legislative Council in Los Angeles, which brought them to Southern California. And that was in 1951.
And do you know where they moved? What neighborhood
Well,
they moved to?
it's a very interesting story because they first wrote to the Park La Brea, which is owned by the Metropolitan Life Insurance. I think it's one of 3 large, kind of
Housing development?
that were promising. Well, they were sort of designed with the intent of young families, many of them coming out of World War II, to kind of these model communities. And so my mother wrote to them and saying that they were looking to relocate, and they were told that there were no vacancies. And then when they did move to Los Angeles, they noticed that there were still advertising. And so they realized that because of their names, that they weren't considered as tenants. So my parents moved to, they got an apartment in Echo Park and started raising their family there. I think they might have even had a place in Hollywood briefly on Lexington. So, they had a couple of places before they moved to Silver Lake.
Do you know where they were in Echo Park?
No. Could find out, but I don't.
That's okay.
This was before I was born. So in 1952, there was an opening in the office of the Attorney General here in Los Angeles. So he, applied for that. He found that some of the assignments he was getting from the state legislature were kind of dry. So he was looking for a more interesting and varied legal experience. And in 1953, after making that move, my parents noticed that there was an open plot of land, far too big for one house, in Silver Lake. My father met with the realtor and was told that it was his company's policy not to sell to minorities, that they wanted to keep the neighborhood white.
Do you know what company it was by any chance?
I don't.
No.
I don't.
And this was, the property was on West Silver Lake Drive?
Yes.
Wow.
That's where I grew up.
So there's quite a bit of land available in 1953 on West Silver Lake Drive.
It was large enough for 3 homes.
3 homes, wow.
Yeah. So my father, being a resourceful attorney and knowing that this was highly illegal, made a trip down to the Hall of Records and looked at the title on the property and contacted the seller directly and asked him, did you know that your agent is engaging in illegal discrimination? And the seller didn't know. So he ordered the realtor to do business with my parents or be fired.
Oh, wow.
And so that's how it came to pass that my parents were able to move into Silver Lake and help break the color line. They subdivided the property into 3 plots, and then in turn sold the other plots to a Chinese family on one side and a Jewish family on the other, who remained our neighbors until that generation passed away.
And what was the reservoir like at that time? You must have been, right, you must have had a view of the reservoir, right?
Well, we were on the flatlands, so...
On the flat part of West Silver Lake.
Three doors in from the reservoir. 2416. And...
West Silver Lake.
Yeah, so just past the corner. It was ironic because 10 years later when, when my father had become a judge, the realtor showed up in his court involved in a dispute over, I guess, the real estate broker fees. And my father looked at him and looked down and recognized his name and called opposing counsel together and said, I know one of the people involved in this dispute. And his attorney said, well, he doesn't have a problem with you presiding over this. My father gave it some thought. And the last thing he wanted to do was to be bending over backwards to try to accommodate him and to make sure that he was impartial. On the other hand, he didn't want the possibility that he was going to also, if he found against him, say, oh well, this was a prejudicial decision by a vindictive, judge or something like that. So he recused himself from that case.
We didn't quite get to how your father became a judge.
Sure. So, at the time, the Attorney General was Edmund G. Brown, Pat Brown. And although he was in the Sacramento office, my father was one of the staff in his Southern California office. And when he declared his candidacy for governor, my father, took him around to meet the elders of Chinatown, and did some who put on a fundraiser for him, and it was after he was elected, in his first week in office, he called my father and offered him a judgeship.
Wow, fantastic.
So it was something completely unexpected. Came out of left field. As a matter of fact, the way my father told it, he was in his office and picked up the phone and heard a voice saying, "Hi, this is Pat." And my father's response was, "Pat who?" I mean, it's not as though they had like a long relationship, but during his campaign, he had publicly stated he wanted to see more diversity within the courts.
Mm-hmm. And, wow. And you weren't born yet?
No, I was born the year that my father was appointed to the bench. So my name, my first and middle name are after Supreme Court justices.
Uh-huh.
So
Marshall,
John Marshall, third good came later, John Marshall, and then John Jay, who were both Supreme Court justices. And then my Chinese name translates as the kind of the path to justice.
Oh, what is your Chinese name?
It's our family name goes first, Wong, Dao, Zheng, or I'm sorry, Jing in Cantonese.
Mm-hmm. So your sister is a few years older than you.
9.
9 years. And did she go to Ivanhoe School
Yes.
before you were born, right?
We all went to Ivanhoe.
You all went to Ivanhoe.
Mm-hmm.
So how many are there of you? There was your
4 siblings.
4.
We're exactly 3 years apart because my mother thought it would cut down on sibling rivalry, and she didn't want to have 2 babies in diapers at the same time.
Oh, I see.
So she was highly organized and a real planner.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we all went to Ivanhoe. We all went to Thomas Starr King. Interestingly, after my parents moved into the neighborhood, the demographics started changing very quickly. So by the time I got to Ivanhoe, it was my classes, and to King, my classes were a third Asian American.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think that by the time I got to King was probably about a third Asian American, a third white, a third Latino, and a handful of black students. But and before that, the first school that I went to was the Jewish Community Center.
Oh, preschool? You went there? Wow.
Yeah, both my brother and I went to preschool. It used to be Hollywood Las Feliz Jewish Community Center. I think it has a new name now.
It's the independent Silver Lake Jewish Community Center.
Mm-hmm.
So you would say that you didn't experience really any discrimination growing up, would you say? You felt pretty comfortable?
I would say that we had a sense of well-being. There were certain things that my parents did not tell us when we were young. It was only older that they told us both about the difficulty in purchasing property, and there was also a neighbor who circulated a petition to keep us out.
Really?
Yeah, and they didn't want us kind of to grow up feeling as though it was a hostile environment. I mean, later in life, I kind of asked my parents, when I was old enough to understand, what had happened, and I asked them, well, I understand why you would want to exercise your right to live where you want to live. I mean, my parents grew up under legal segregation. And so when my father grew up, I mean, there were only certain parts of Bakersfield they could live in. His family could only sit in the balcony of the movie theater. Asians, blacks, Latinos were only allowed to swim in the public pool 1 day a week, because the next day they drained it and cleaned it. So that's what he grew up with. And so, I understood why he would want to assert his rights. But I said, didn't it make you uncomfortable moving into a place which was potentially hostile? And they believed, as I have come to believe, that people can get past their fears, that through positive contact, and that strangers can become neighbors. And that's exactly what happened.
Did you play with kids on West Silver Lake Drive and invite friends home from Ivanhoe? Excuse me, I'm sorry, who were kind of mixed racially? Right?
Yeah.
Did your parents go to church in Silver Lake, or?
They joined the Presbyterian church right on Lucille, near the Sunset Junction area. And my father was an elder in that church. Yeah, it's now.
And there was kind of a mixed population there.
Yeah, I think it's now a Korean congregation. But it was a time where there was a lot of social upheaval. This being the 1960s and early 70s, and my parents were very liberal and very community-minded, and so my elder siblings were going to college right during the heyday of the protests against the war in Vietnam. My mother took me to my first protest demonstration, where when I was a child, where we marched with other Asian Americans, including the actor George Takei, as a contingent within a larger anti-war demonstration.
So Japanese and Chinese people together?
Yes, it was an Asian American contingent against the war.
We're kind of united. Oh, that's nice.
So,
And were your parents involved in anything in the community? I mean,
lots of things.
Yeah, really? Like,
Yeah. So, some of the traditional things that they were involved in were like the PTA, and my father was the head of the Cub Scout troop. But they were also very much involved in a lot of the services for Chinatown. My father at one point was the president of the board of the Chinatown Service Center, which provides largely senior services. They were involved in the Chinatown Teen Post.
what's that?
The Chinatown Teen Post.
I don't know what that is.
Oh, okay. It's an organization, that was serving the youth of Chinatown during a period when there was a lot of let's say negative behaviors. And there was a gang problem back then, and so the Chinatown Teen Post was a place that was trying to serve a lot of children, young people who didn't have a whole lot of social support. They were involved in supporting the arts. The East-West Players got started in the basement of our family's church.
Is that right? The East-West Players?
Yeah.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Huh.
Actually, one of the founders had been friends with my mother since they were 15 years old. And, so my parents were supportive of that. And then my mother was instrumental in raising money to build the first library in Chinatown.
Oh, wow.
She was also involved in the music center. They started a Chinatown Democratic Club, or in their front room, in the living room. They're active in the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which at that time put on something called Brotherhood Camp.
Oh, yeah, I know that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And in high school, were you involved in, like any kind of progressive groups or sports or drama?
Probably the thing that I got most involved in is those presentation that was made by organizers with the United Farm Workers Union.
Uh-huh.
I did not go to John Marshall High School.
Oh, you didn't? I thought you said you did.
All of my older siblings did. But
where did you go?
At that time, when I was entering the 9th grade, there was a move afoot to create an alternative school. There were a few different ones, and so this was for what was called Area H. That I guess it would have been Silver Lake down to the downtown area, stretching across, serving Highland Park, Glassell Park, and so it was an experiment in an open classroom, experiential education. So I attended my 9th through 12th grade there, which was very, very different than going to a traditional school.
And your parents suggested you do that, or that was you? Yeah. And then you went to college.
Yes. Oh, and so so I was very involved in the local boycott committee of the United Farm Workers.
United Farm Workers, right?
Yeah. And so it was that was sort of in its heyday as far as we were working to get non-union lettuce, grapes, wine out of the local supermarkets and liquor stores. So
boycott.
So several times a week, my friends and I would be the primary people out there, picketing and asking people not to shop at these businesses until they agreed to. That was an unusual experience for like a teenager.
Yeah. And you're kind of a mixed group of kids, I guess.
Yeah.
Out of Area H High School.
Area H Alternative School. Yeah, we met. There were other people who were older who also participated in the boycott committee. Handful of high school students from other schools, and obviously a much larger, movement afoot that was spearheaded by, a lot of people in the Catholic Church as well as, primarily Chicano activists. So I was so gung ho about it that I took about 10 weeks out of my senior year of high school and went to study in Mexico because I thought it would be important as far as allowing me to do the volunteer work in a more effective way.
So you became fluent in Spanish?
Conversational. I lived with a family that didn't speak any English, and I was studying 5 hours a day, and so it was an immersion experience.
And did you do anything in Silver Lake, like a hangout that was sort of fun, or?
Sure. I took art classes at Barnstall. Let's see, what did they used to call it? There was an arts festival every summer that moved around. I'm blanking on the name because it was something garden.
So you're kind of artistic yourself?
Oh, I was always interested in art classes and museums and things like that. I took piano lessons in Atwater. A group of my friends were involved in international folk dance, so I tagged along with them at some of the area colleges, as well as there was a place called The Intersection, not too far away. There was a folk dance cafe.
And did you ride bikes around the reservoir or anything?
Oh, walked, yeah, both.
Great.
Silver Lake was a very, very pleasant place to grow up. It was kind
pretty
of
safe.
It was like a little oasis of suburbia in the middle of the inner city. Now, of course, there were a couple of things that happened along the way which kind of challenged, our sense of safety. I remember, in elementary school, the Manson family murders, and my parents actually knew the La Bianca family from the local schools, so that was kind of shocking. And then a few years later, I think the Hillside Strangler
That's right.
was striking, and you know, women were disappearing, and so I think that those were some of the kind of the cast a shadow over what was otherwise a pretty, you know, kind of idyllic kind of place to live and grow up.
Where did you go to college?
Went to UCLA. I actually I transferred to UCLA as a junior. I worked and took part-time classes, and I delayed enrolling for a few years. So I did my junior and senior year at UCLA, and then I did my master's in social work there as well.
Oh. And did you have pretty strong idea that you wanted to do the kind of work that you do now here in LA? You wanted to stay in LA and work with hate crimes and discrimination?
Yeah, I was interested in civil rights and you know, integration of and advocacy for new immigrant communities. That was so much a part of my own family history that, you know, I wanted. And growing up with kinds of stories about, you know, what my grandparents went through, and, you know, some of my own parents' experiences made me want to do something that would remove those kinds of barriers for other people. So, you know,
that's great.
Yeah. So I wound up leaving LA after college for a decade, almost 11 years. I lived in Washington, D.C.
Working for the government?
I worked in the mayor's office first, serving first as, of all things, in the mayor's office in Latino affairs, where I was doing work with agencies serving Central American refugees. And then they created a parallel office to serve as the liaison with the Asian American community. So I was the head of that for a few years. And then I worked at the Smithsonian in the area of multicultural education.
And what brought you back here then?
Well, my parents were getting along in their years, and I barely spent time with them for more than a decade. So I knew that I wanted to spend quality time with them and be around if and when they needed assistance. So one of the things that I did when I returned is I wrote a biography about my father's life, and interviewing him, you know, was a real cherished memory.
So your house on West Silver Drive, who did design it? What architect designed it? Or was it your dad? Or
My parents worked with a Chinese-American architect, Gilbert Leung, who was a family friend. And this being the 50s, it you know, was very mid-century modern, indirect lighting, and you know, I had no idea at the time, but you know, it's sort of what people look back on as vintage now, kind of Mad Men era.
And the same architect designed the two other houses on the...
I don't know who designed their homes. Yes, and so actually when we just put it on the market, my mother passed away last November, and we had a company come in and stage it, and it was very funny because they staged it using all of these vintage pieces of furniture, you know, including manual typewriters and things like that I actually grew up with.
Yeah.
So it was very funny seeing things that were similar to what, but they weren't ours.
And no one from the family wanted to take over the house?
You know,
just didn't work out that way?
There are only two of us are still in Los Angeles, and neither of us needed a 5-bedroom house.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, come on over. So, why don't you tell us about this book?
So this was a biography that I worked on. It took several years. I had no idea what an undertaking it was going to be to document my father's career on the bench. But most importantly, I wanted to sort of understand and answer two questions. One was, what were the life experiences that shaped and informed his idea and sense of what justice meant? And also, how did the cases that he heard and presided over reflect some of the turbulent times of the 1960s and 70s when he was on the bench.
What court was he in exactly?
He was in the Superior Court and spent a stint on an appellate panel. He served for more than 20 years, and when he retired, he was #1 in seniority in the entire Superior Court system. It's typical that people will, get appointed as judges and then step out and go to a private firm and quadruple their salaries.
But not your dad.
He was very content. He found his work very satisfying, and he heard interesting cases. The one that he was most proud of was one that ultimately went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, Cohen versus California, but it was about actually a young man who had entered a courthouse downtown, and he had this was during the Vietnam War. His girlfriend, I believe, had made him a jacket that said "fuck the draft" on the back, and he removed it before he went into a courtroom, and then when he emerged from the courtroom, he was arrested for disturbing the peace. So he was convicted. My father was part of a 3-judge panel that overturned his conviction. It went up to a higher court and then ultimately to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they found that it was constitutionally protected speech. But if my father would always point out that if you counted up the judges who were voting for conviction versus acquittal, they lined up and they were exactly the same number. Yeah. It was just the distribution at the different levels of the courts that finally, set this guy free. And so that's why he always insisted that every single judicial appointment is important and needs to be scrutinized.
Great. Oh, wonderful legacy. Okay, and these?
Well, this was made probably at about less than a year old. I was walking at 9 months, and I'm going to guess that this was not at our home, but at some place where they had different apparatus for children to play with. This is a photo of my father when he was the scoutmaster, and me in my uniform. I would guess that I'm about 8 years old there. And in front of the family station wagon. And that's right on West Silver Lake Drive, in front of our home. These are me and my 3 older siblings in our backyard. At one point, my mother ran a preschool in our backyard. I don't have any memories of that, so it must have been when I was very young.
And this is your mom, I guess.
Yes, this was a book that we put together for her 90th birthday, just with, we had the whole family together, had a couple of nice meals out. She had moved into a retirement community in the city of Alhambra, but was still in very good health and spirits.
Your dad died before that?
My father passed away, this would have been 2006. He was a golfer. He got up and played 18 holes and complained of chest pains afterwards, and it was something that was undiagnosable. He had tears in his aorta and he passed away during surgery, emergency surgery. But he had lived a long, both of them, healthy, happy lives up until the last day. Neither of them suffered. Neither of them went through long periods of decline, either physically or cognitively. They were able to enjoy every day on earth.
Oh, that's great. So this picture, maybe you could
hold it up.
Just hold it up, yeah.
So this was my father and his younger brother, who actually was killed serving in World War II. My paternal grandfather, Earl, who immigrated from Guangdong province in southern China, and my grandmother, Alice, who was born in California in a town called Weaverville, which was a mining town, and then they met and married and raised a family in Bakersfield, Kern County, where they lived for their entire lives.
And this one?
I actually forget what family celebration this was. This was not Silver Lake. This was in the backyard of my brother, Kent, in the Carthay Circle area. But, obviously, I'm going to guess that we were celebrating one of my parents' anniversaries, which is why we would have been a little bit more dressed up than usual, and why a number of the family members are wearing red, which is Chinese people wear red to celebrations.
And then there's another black and white.
Also, my siblings and I are in the living room, in the family room.
This is you?
Yeah, I'm the youngest. Yes, posed for a photo maybe around holidays.
Did you celebrate Chinese holidays and American?
Yes, so we celebrated Chinese New Year's, which is the most important holiday, and would frequently go to Chinatown for a banquet and for the parade, and Moon Festival, usually with a special family meal. Those were the big ones.
Oh, thank you so much for bringing those.